I am Jimbo Paris, and you are listening to The Jimbo Paris Show. All right, how's it going, everyone? This is Jimbo Paris, and welcome to The Jimbo Paris Show. And today we have Jeff Getty. How's it going, man?
Hey, how are you today?
Good, good. All right. So, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure, be happy to. So I am technically by background, I'm a tax attorney who has spent the majority of his career working with closely held business owners as they transition or transact those businesses. I left the practice of law quite a few years ago to work as a consultant and business advisor, and have been doing that for Key Bank now for the past 11 years.
Okay, okay. And why the last 11 years? What happened during those 11 years?
Well, so I decided to leave my own consulting practice and join up with the bank, primarily because of the opportunity to present itself inside their client book of business. There's a generational shift that most people are aware of that's going on, where about 65% of all closely held businesses inside the United States are owned by baby boomers. And banks tend to have a lot of those business owners and entrepreneurs as clients. And in order to make the largest impact to the largest number of clients, I thought joining up inside of a bank channel or chassis would make a lot of sense.
Okay. So where did this passion of working with banks and finance start as a kid?
I'm not sure it started as a kid. So I was in a very traditional background, right? The working as a child, or did the whole lawn mowing and that sort of thing. But as I started taking on additional responsibilities through high school, taking on different jobs and such, and through college, I became really interested in entrepreneurship, and how entrepreneurs built things and then ultimately transitioned or transacted things, and decided to go to law school to see if I could learn more about how to help them do that. And did that on my own and in private practice for quite some time, and decided at some point that I was spending so much time out on client acquisition that I thought it was impeding my ability to spend more time on actually working on those clients and helping them reach an optimized outcome, whatever they were trying to achieve. So I guess the passion started with, I just enjoyed learning how people create things, make money, build things. And the part of that, I'm not an engineer by background. I don't make things. The part that I could add some real value to is how to help people successfully monetize and move things from transfer from entrepreneur to sitting on a beach or whatever their passion was.
And that you said transfer. Can you kind of elaborate on what you mean by that? That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, so when people talk about generally inside of businesses, and they usually talk about mergers and acquisitions or M&A work, which traditionally means selling the business to a third party, more
Right.
recently, typically private equity groups. I tend to talk about business transfers and transitions a little more broader scope, right? So we do certainly work with owners whose intention is to sell it to a strategic buyer or private equity group or something like that. But that is the majority of what we do, but not a huge one. We also assist owners with transitions to family members. For example, I'm going to give it to my kids, part gift, part sell to my kids, or I'm going to transition it to my management team or to my employees, right? So ESOPs, management buyouts, things like that. So it's a very wide scope, right? We don't come in with a preconceived notion with any business owner that, hey, in order to achieve what you want to achieve, you have to sell to this type of buyer, right? We look at it very holistically, and sit down, and what's more important than me asking, or telling a client what they should do to optimize value, it's more important for me to actively listen to them and say, what is it you're trying to achieve? Because it's not always about getting the highest dollar figure.
Okay. And what are some of the, kind of the big, like, notable experiences you've had in this career of yours so far?
Oh, wow. Um, so I can start at a very high level and say that the largest surprise to me as an advisor has been how infrequently businesses, the transition channel chosen or the transfer channel chosen around their business is based on the highest value they're going to receive. That was a big shock to me because I just assumed that as entrepreneurs, when I was younger, that they would always try to get the most out of the deal possible. The biggest shakeup for me along those lines was many years ago. I worked with a business owner who was in a small town in Ohio. He was the primary employer to that town and had every intention of quote unquote selling and retiring to that small town where he had grown up and started this business. And we received a number of offers on his behalf for that business. And he ended up not taking any of them. He ended up actually doing an ESOP, an employee stock ownership plan, because he didn't want to see the town he had grown up in, the people he had employed, the ancillary businesses that he had helped create, supporting his employees in his business, be destroyed by some sort of sale to a third party where they would have taken something out of his community. That was a big surprise. I think other big surprises I've seen over the years is, as much as I do respect and like the clients I deal with, it was a big surprise to me how few of them actually understand the intricacies of how transitions and transactions work. I think coming in as a young attorney, I believed that most of them knew how to get to the end state, whatever that looked like, the end of the business cycle, so to speak, for them. It was a big surprise to me how often I was spending more and more time educating people, more so than providing really technical advice. It was more basic education type stuff. That was a surprise to me. And then I'd say the last piece that's really been a shock is the what I call the family matters piece. Family issues that underlie inside of a family don't get better with a business, and they certainly don't get better once the business is sold or transitioned, right? If there's underlying issues or concerns or problems inside the family structure, they're going to transcend the ownership structure or where the business goes. So oftentimes I end up in conversations with people about children, grandchildren, spouses,
Mm.
relationships. That's not technical stuff, but doing it for 26 years, you kind of get a flavor as to where there might be an issue. And then I generally try to tell clients stories about how other clients have navigated through these issues successfully or unsuccessfully to help them become self-aware or or to find other advisors to help them navigate some of those thornier issues.
So you bring up a very, very interesting thing because while you are an extremely technical man, you also talk about, telling stories.
Yep.
That's a different social spectrum that I definitely want to get into later in this interview. But one question I need to ask is, so if we were to take everything that you did, what do you kind of specifically do technically, like in your area? Like you kind of showed a bit of everything that you do, but what do you specifically do?
Yeah, so from a very technical standpoint, right? That's
Mm.
what you're asking. First and foremost, I would consider myself a transactional tax attorney, right? That's
Okay.
really where I was trained in historically. I have a law degree and a master's degree in tax. And from a very hardcore technical background, I would say of over my career, 50% of my professional advisory time has been spent walking clients through and or structuring deals to achieve the best tax result, right? So that would be
Mm.
the largest single category of what I do. Um, After that, I would say the other big piece, and again, this is something you kind of learn, no one really trains you to do, is to negotiate deals on behalf of clients, right? So I get into situations where the business owner, it's they're going down a path, and they're typically the folks on the proverbial other side of the table are sophisticated, strategic. Competitors or private equity groups that have very sophisticated people on those staff whose job it is full time to negotiate purchases and to come in and use my professional expertise, knowledge, and experience with financial modeling, understanding strategic synergies and things like that to help clients articulate a story and fight back against the counter stories to
Mm.
get them the best deal possible. So, on a very basic level, I'd say those are the two major things I do as a technical person.
Okay, excellent. And you're kind of jumping into that storytelling area too. And
Yeah.
again, storytelling is very important to you, but you know, how did you begin to tell stories? Because again, you have a lot of experience from what I could interpret from you.
Yeah. So from my vantage point, what I found is first and foremost, there's a lot of good technical people out there, whether it's financial modeling, tax advisor, whatever it is. Um, and but that doesn't necessarily transcend easily to a client who spent their career manufacturing widgets, let's say, right? Make it a simple example, or one that's not actually real. How do you distill that out where someone can get their arms around it fairly quickly, right? So again, going back to what I said much earlier, education is a large part of what I do. Educating someone, walking through what a process is going to look like, what's going to happen over the next 3, 6, 8, 10, 20 months, whatever it is. And it's really easy to slip into technical speak or try to provide like a linear timeline process or a how-to book that just talks about the nuts and bolts of how to negotiate contracts or something. What I found pretty early on, primarily as a speaker, was nobody wants to hear that. How you catch people's attention and hold their attention so they're actively listening to what you're saying, so you're able to provide them good advice. People like to hear stories. They like to be able to place themselves inside some portion piece or the whole story and understand how they can utilize someone else's experience guided by me who was there through it to explain what I saw, what the client saw, what the buyer saw, whatever, and make it a more of a narrative than instead of a series of technical details. So that's how I ended up doing it. It primarily was based off of experience and then doing a lot of public speaking where people would stop yawning when I told stories.
Okay, very good, very good. Now, the next question I have is, what does wealth technically mean to you?
In the context for me personally, wealth, or like in the context of what I think clients need to hear, want to hear. I guess I'm sorry to
I
ask
want to
what.
know from your perspective.
Yeah, so to me, wealth somewhat transcends dollar figures, right? There's wealth of certainly financial wealth, right? That's fairly easy. How much do I have in my account, so to speak? But there's emotional wealth and wealth being. There's a familial wealth and wealth being, right? And then there's what I call maybe legacy or giving back to community of wealth, right? What am I giving back to the community? Either my time, my talents, or just money. So it transcends a lot of different areas, and I think that's based on somewhat personality and trying to find a good balance between my life, my professional life, and my personal life, but then also having the experience of having had a number of clients who were older than me pass on. And when they're towards the end of their life cycle, what it is they want to talk about, what it is they focus on, tends to be a lot more than just the money. Right. So wealth to me covers a lot of areas, not just the traditional definition of financial wealth.
Okay, okay. And when this continued to happen, how did you begin to sort of teach people about taxes and how taxes work?
So primarily when I was, when I came out of school, because I was trained in tax and how, and, the technical aspects of when you're faced with a situation, how to navigate through that. And then what I found was working inside of a law firm environment, and then even later on, is that most people with that background experience tend to they don't want to do it, but they end up doing it, losing people in the technical aspects. They like to use a lot of acronyms. They like to have a bunch of very detailed, explicit examples that talk about things that most people wouldn't know or care about. I actually found it to be a little more interesting to talk about at a very high level, features and benefits around tax strategy or particular strategies without ever actually naming the strategy. So an example would be, instead of telling a client the acronym for a particular trust strategy that'll save taxes, I would say, hey, if I could show you a way where you would somewhat limit access to assets inside of a vehicle for a period of time, but it would gain you a tax benefit equivalent to a reduction of 10, 15, 20% of your tax rate on a transaction. Would that interest you? Right. So I try to bring it down to a level where people could understand, like, they don't care about the acronym, just what's the feature and benefit of me doing so, and a little bit of what's the cost of me doing so. And once I take the conversation, or learned how to take the conversation to that level, I could have a really meaningful dialogue with clients about, how much they really need out of something immediately versus what they can defer versus what they're willing to give up to someone else. That's getting to the meat of the philosophical view around, wealth and wealth management, and moving something through a transaction. So different approach.
Okay. And when you're coaching your clients maybe on how to learn these things, do you use books as a resource? Do you just sit down with them and kind of discuss it with them? How do people even know in the first place if they need you? You
Yeah.
may be their knight in shining armor and they don't even know, that you're there for them.
Yeah. So I don't typically use books. When I have clients who really want to understand a lot of details around certain things, I will at times suggest an author that's written on some topics, but that's pretty rare. For the most part, it's conversational, right? When I sit down with someone, I try to wipe the slate of, any preconceived notions, even if the person who's introduced me to them has given me additional intel about them, about what they think they've heard or what they think the client actually wants. I will what I call actively listen, and lead with open-ended questions. Tell me about yourself. Tell me about what good looks like in the next 3 to 5 years, what great looks like in the next 3 to 5 years. And then once I have a flavor, right, of how much time, effort, and their end goal they're trying to look for, then I can sort of back into, based on how they responded in the personality of the response, to start to build in my mind the appropriate way to send follow-up materials for them to read, stuff they can look at on the internet, or the next meeting, what sort of materials I will bring in as far as modeling or sampling goes. I've got clients that want to know every minutia detail of how funds flow through a deal, where things go, how they're held, like the titles, the names, everything, right? And I've got other clients who are like, just give me the big picture, right? Like, or if you were in my shoes, that's one of my favorite things, and say, look, I know we've spent the last few months, few weeks, whatever, talking about a lot of different topics and outcomes. Let me put myself in your shoes for a second. And let me tell you the balance that I see, knowing a little bit about you, what I would do if I were in your shoes. So I'm really big on offering what I consider real advice experience, and saying, hey, I can throw 50 different things at you, and it's hard for you to decipher what's the right choices. I will absolutely tell somebody, if I were in your shoes, here's the pieces and parts I would choose as far as an overall tax strategy, and why I would do so, what the balance factors are. And if you want to dial it up or dial it down, here's the other piece or part you can insert or take away to custom fit for you.
Now, you mentioned the word custom fit.
Mm-hmm.
So from how I see it, you tend to, when it comes to tax management, you tend to tailor a lot of your methods to specific people. Can you kind of elaborate on that, and maybe how regular businesses in general that just do coaching and consulting can maybe perform tailoring as well?
Yeah, I think there's a preconceived notion with tax advisors generally that clients are either going to fall in one of two camps, right? They're either going to be always super conservative and do the bare minimum, right? Hey, taxes are a blessing, right? Like, you got to keep 70% of what you made. Or they are, well, my clients are 1,000% on board. We have to do everything to squeeze every penny possible out of a deal or a transaction. And I don't think any client really fits in either of those camps particularly well. I mean, there are people that do, but I wouldn't know that walking into a situation, even if I've got to meet them a few times. So I tend to, in the first couple of discussions with them, listen, like I said, pretty actively, get a flavor as to how far I think they want to push things, and then lay out some scenarios in a very summary level like a conservative, middle of the road, and aggressive tax planning strategies, right? And what those outcomes would look like. And then I attach all the modeling behind that, but I don't typically go through that with them because I don't want them distracted on trying to figure out why on page 13 there's the decimals here versus here. Like that's details that they don't need to understand at that stage. And based on their reactions, right? Like, okay, if the middle of the road approach looks attractive, you've moved your tax rate down from a 30% to a 20% rate, and there's some parameters around what you've given up, control wise, what you've given up, access wise, things like that. They seem to gravitate towards that. Then I can come back with, okay, you seem to be modeling more towards the middle of aggressiveness and outcome. Let's look at what else we can bolt on to make it look a little more attractive or a little less aggressive. That's kind of the way I tend to lay things out. It's more time consuming, right? It's more work on my side because there's a lot more modeling that goes on and a lot more give and take instead of hey, every client of mine does X, ergo you must do X, and here's what that looks like. I try to stay away from that thought process because clients are all unique in what they're trying to achieve or what their risk tolerances are, what their ability to pay to get outcomes are. So I don't want to preconceive that they have to fit in particular boxes.
Okay. And when it comes to people that you sort of look up to and see as role models, do you think you have anyone in particular?
Sure. I mean, I would say from a technical standpoint, I was, very blessed early on in my career to have some mentors that were exceptionally good at what they did. There's one particular, trust in a state tax attorney that I knew in Wilmington, Delaware, who was a fantastic mentor, who just recently retired. I really respect him and really appreciate, how he helped me navigate. He was a very young lawyer through very difficult, in my opinion, minefields of clients or client taxation issues and how to appropriately talk about them. And then I've had a couple of mentors along the way who have been excessively helpful to me or colleagues in fine tuning approaches, discussions, speaking, conversations. I love to speak in foreign groups. It's an interesting challenge. I love getting hard questions. I love getting pushback from people. And I had some folks in my life that really helped me be comfortable with that and navigate. And then I'd say the last piece is that kind of interesting for me is that my wife, who I've been married to for 25 years, has always helped me on my written work. She's a great editor and is an attorney by background as well, and does just a phenomenally outstanding job for me to tell me, you lost me here. You need to rewrite this because I'm not exactly the end user you're focused on. And if I don't get it, they're definitely not going to get it. So there's been a few people I could definitely point to and say, yes, super impactful, right? Really helpful to help my career along and help me create or become what I've become.
Okay. And when you continue to grow and sort of improve yourself, how does it feel to have, $8 billion in transactional experience? Because that's a lot of money.
Is. Yeah. So, it feels actually really good because it's one of the ways people in my field track their success as a professional, right? It means I must be doing something right in my approach and my outcomes for clients. I think overall, because like I said, most of my clients, it wasn't about the highest dollar value possible. It was trying to create a custom made outcome for them that makes me feel really good that so many people have entrusted me with doing that. I mean, for most people, this is their largest single financial event, and the fact that so many of them have entrusted me to do it makes me feel really good. So that's a good way to categorize or look at, hey, that's a lot of deals, and particularly since I deal with closely held. It's not like I sold a big publicly traded company for $3 billion and that's half of my count. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of transactions from 3 million plus. That's a lot of deals to get up to the 8 billion mark. So actually feels pretty good to me. And the other part that I feel pretty good about is there's, I believe it's Price Waterhouse Coopers that does a study each year that interviews entrepreneurs roughly 12 months after they do a transaction and to find out how happy they are with the outcome. And about 70 to 75% in each year's study come back and they have some level of regret. Some's fairly severe, some not. It's not always about financial, right? There's other factors. Because most of the clients I deal with, and one certainly a key that I've been dealing with, stay with key after the fact. The fact they've stayed says to me that most of them would be in that 25%. They were quite happy with the outcome because if they weren't, they wouldn't still be working with us. So the fact that so many people stick around, so many of my clients refer me to people they know, and the overall numbers are pretty good. I actually feel pretty good about that.
Okay. And your mindset, from something I could tell, seems to be very you seem to be very optimistic. Has your mindset always been like this? I was expecting someone a little bit more, you know, how should I say it? Perfectionistic, but you don't give off that vibe, if you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I'm glad you picked up on it. I have a saying with the folks that I've got a team of directors that works for me that helps me work on a lot of deals and handles a lot of their own. And I always have a saying like, let's not get perfect, get in the way of good enough, right? Like you can spend a lot of time trying to get everything 100% perfect, and it just burns energy, right? I try to hit with a pretty hard success rate, try to read situations, try to read outcomes, and overall pleased with them. So, am I always optimistic? No. There's been definitely points in my career where I've seen the market's volatility, deal flow fall off, client outcomes, deals that fall apart, clients that are unhappy, right? Clients who switch streams. I mean, so I'm not always optimistic, but as a general rule, I would say that I'm excessively lucky in the fact that, over the years, I've certainly run into prior classmates or prior colleagues, and the level of unhappiness a lot of people have professionally is pretty high, right? Lawyers in particular tend to be, in my experience, fairly unhappy. I tell people all the time, I love what I do. I mean, I really, truly enjoy it. I love understanding what makes businesses tick and things like that. And I really enjoy working for the people. For the most part, I've been hired to work for, like as far as clients go. So, yeah, so I guess I am pretty optimistic about that because I genuinely enjoy going to work. I do a lot of traveling, going to meet people, walking their facilities, understanding what's going on. And I guess it shows by coming across as a positive person. And I guess maybe overall I am, but I definitely have my moments.
Okay. And when you first started to kind of run this whole establishment, how did you feel? Like from kind of an emotional standpoint? Like, did you ever think to yourself, I can do this, I can't do this? Were you always like this?
No, I was not always like this. I think the first time I was put into particularly a deal meeting by myself, I was, excessively nervous, probably even a little bit scared, right? Like I can't believe someone's entrusting me to do this. But there's an inflection point, right? I think, at least for me, this happened where at some point during that growth process, whether it was the first deal I did by myself or the first time I really spoke up as a second chair, so to speak, when I realized that I knew as much about this, or in some cases more than the other person or the other party I was negotiating against or the client I was speaking to, and it showed, and experience shows, and I could bring in a lot of background and experience to it. It becomes self-fulfilling. You feel good about it. So there was definitely a point when it happened where I felt like I knew what I was doing well enough to be good at it. But certainly after that point, I wouldn't have been that way. I would have been, I can remember being a little bit nervous about going into meetings. And now it's just, I do it so frequently, I don't even think about it.
Okay. And what I'm thinking here is, so you're working with taxes, and maybe this is a very basic question, but from a standard level, what are taxes and why are they so important?
Well, I mean, from the government standpoint or from society standpoint, they're important because, taxes fund the things we all enjoy, right? Whether we choose to admit it or not. The fact that there's highways we can drive on, or there's police and fire department and ambulances that help us to other pieces of infrastructure, national defense. So taxes to fund government systems are in and of themselves important. I feel very strongly about that. Having said that, I have the philosophy that I'm willing to pay, and my clients are more likely willing to pay their share. They don't want to pay a disproportionate share, right? So they don't want to feel like they've been, taken advantage of. So from that perspective, I usually tell people that start off in a first meeting that, look, there are certain things inside the Internal Revenue Code or the state revenue codes that are given to people like yourself, to provide incentives for people like yourself to start up, build, and then ultimately transition or transact your business. It's my job at a bare minimum to teach you what those freebies are, and then to the extent we can push those to the highest level possible. I didn't write the law. I don't really interpret the laws. My job is to find out how far you can bend the law or push things into gray area. How far you want to push them is not my decision. It's your decision, risk reward factors, things like that. But that's generally how I talk about taxes, right? And I'd start off with like paying zero taxes is problematic for as a society. And I don't think most clients, maybe some would be okay paying zero, but they're okay with paying their fair share. And I'm like, let me help you define how you do that in the way that's most appropriate within the confines of the legal parameters we've been given.
Okay. And why do you think in general, like I notice in society, we tend to have a very negative connotation about taxes.
Mm-hmm.
Taxes always kind of had a bit of a notorious reputation. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a couple things going on. I think generally we tend to feel that it's an overburdensome or overreach by the government. I mean, if you look at the way taxes were historically paid, versus how they're currently paid. Like the federal income tax hasn't really been around all that long. The federal state tax has not been around all that long, so to speak. So it's almost like an intrusion, right? And I think there's certain mouthpieces in our society, whether it's political or not, who tend to like to push that agenda. So I think that's where we get kind of a very negative connotation. And I think part of it is, to be fair, is that you can look around and see some of the things that people perceive as poor policy by government. So you're kind of wasting my tax dollars. I don't believe in a vacuum. Most people would say completely defunding the government in its entirety is a good idea, right? Or any government, or at least some of the governments. But I just don't want to pay more than I should, or more than, let's quote unquote, my share. Finding that right realm, finding that right thing is a little bit tougher. So that's definitely part of it. And then I think it almost becomes, for some people, almost a game, right? Because if they do any sort of heavy duty tax strategy work on an annual basis with their business, or even if they're not a business owner, they start to see it more or less as a game, like how little can I actually pay? So that certainly, permeates and pushes people to do this. And then I think the last piece is professionals like myself tend to make so many of these conversations about so heavily tax driven and avoiding taxes that it becomes a mindset of entrepreneurs and just wealthy people in general to avoid as much as possible. I try to stay out of that realm. I mean, surprisingly enough, I try to read the situation, not put my preconceived notions. And I'll tell you a quick story about this. Many years ago, I dealt with a client who, when I asked them where they wanted the final, amount of their money when they were gone, so through their estate plan, where their money would go. And he said something I'd never heard before. I've heard people say lots of things: leave it to my dog, leave it to this charity, that charity, family, friends, whatever it is. And he said, I want to leave everything to the Department of Public Welfare in Pennsylvania. And I said, okay, that's a first for me. Would you mind me asking why? And he said, sure. He's like, I grew up in the Depression. I lost my parents and I was on my own. And the state took me in. The state raised me, basically. taught me how to get educated, became educated, and I ended up being very successful. And I have distant family, but not close. And I really believe the fact that I'm standing here today and did all these things in my life was because the state helped me. And therefore, I'm going to give this back to the state. Unusual for sure, but I really always, that story's always stuck in my mind. I really respected that because he saw the value of a government entity doing something for good, and it was very personal to him, but saw that there was good that could come out of it, and wanted to give it back. So very different experience for me. I don't usually hear something like that.
That's interesting. What were your opinions on the Great Depression?
Wow, there's so much food, there's so much fodder there to take on. So I think I'm not an economist, so this is me looking at this from a very general standpoint. I think it was first and foremost the initial stages were driven by unbridled greed and lack of regulation, and then that got us into it. And then the failure of government to do anything for quite some period of time made it worse. The part I find most fascinating about it when I've studied it, which hasn't been all that much, is in my opinion, and I didn't just make this up, I've seen this in a number of, other authors and history books talk about this, is what really took us out of the Depression was World War II, right? So there had to be this large, in its very simplest form, government spending expenditure to get us out, right? So there were a lot of mistakes made early on, before, during, and even after. Some of which have been addressed, right? We haven't had one since then, knock on wood. We've had, economic downturns for sure. But I think the best example I know in my lifetime was, the financial crisis of, 08, 09, was in part kept out of the Depression by the tools which are at the government's disposal to keep things afloat. Now, we could argue which tools could have been used more or less and how things were done right or wrong. But it's hard to argue, in my mind, that had we done the approach as the government did in the 20s, we probably would have had, 25, 30% unemployment and people standing in long bread lines. I know some people had that experience, but it wasn't as widespread as it was in the 20s and 30s. So.
Okay. And when we kind of talk about your next step, what is sort of the future of you and your business?
So I think it's a really good question, actually. So there's no foreseeable slowdown in what I do, or complete stoppage, let's say. We do have slowdowns and faster versus less fast periods of time. But, even though there's some headwinds in the M&A space right now, rising interest rates, general economic, challenges, things like that, because I work in closely held businesses under, for the most part, under, a certain size, those aren't driven as much by financials as they are demographics, right? So because there's this enormous transfer that's going to happen, or transition, if you prefer that word, with the baby boomers of their businesses to other places, people, private equity, whatever it is, that's not going to stop just because there's some headwinds, even if those headwinds last quite some period of time. So I think we'll continue to see ups and downs for the next decade, let's call it. And then the issue becomes what happens with these big roll-ups, right? So a lot of these companies I deal with are being bought by firms that are, creating these massive funds and strategies out of a bunch of bundled up companies. The backside of that, I'm not sure exactly what that looks like. Like at some point, no one has anything left to roll up. There's nothing left to buy. There's no more synergies to squeeze out of it. I would think that my role, if I'm still doing this 10, 15 years from now, I do most of my work now selling businesses from entrepreneurs to funds into bigger companies. I would imagine that when the baby boomers have done all their transitions and transactions, And then we're going to be a little bit of a flip zone where some of those folks that have acquired them will be looking to sell them to that new generation of entrepreneurs. I mean, there's there's something inside our society, and a lot of democratic societies or republics, that cause large groups, not a majority, but a sizable minority of people who want to be their own boss, to run their own business, to build something of substance. And we'll probably be looking at this um, after the baby boomers are done with their sell off, so to speak, and then there'll be another group of people who are buying those to pull them out of the funds and restart them as separate enterprises. That's my best guess. What I'll see in my career. I don't know beyond that, I've looking in the crystal ball 20, 30 years from now. Boy, that's really hard to say, but I think that's the likely scenario I'll see unfold over the next 10, 15 years.
Excellent. And do you have a website?
So the firm, bank does have one. I usually tell people that if you want, and you can certainly go on there and look up business advisory service. So it's key.com, and business advisory services is the team I manage. And you can see some of our materials. I am a fairly regular speaker, so there's information on there on speaking engagements around the country. And there'll be information about that. And I'm almost done with my book, which that'll be available on the website as well. You might have to fill out some information to get it for free, but otherwise, I'm sure it'll be on Amazon. Yeah, so I don't have my personal website. This is more of a firm website.
Excellent. So I'm just curious, but how do people who sort of want to work with you or learn about you sort of find you on social media? Do they follow you? Do they connect with you?
Yep, most people connect with me on LinkedIn. And
Okay, that's what
reach
it is.
out. So I do have a LinkedIn profile. It's Jeffrey, Jeffrey Getty, Getty.
Okay.
Pretty easy to find. There I am. Picture is not that dated. Actually, it's been done fairly recently. But thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, most people connect with me there. And if someone is actually inside of a key bank market, a lot of clients will find me through their key bank relationship manager. But by all means, you can reach out direct, and it's fairly easy to find me or connect with me.
Great. All right. And additionally, I'm wondering, how do you market yourself? Is it just LinkedIn, or is there anything else additional you use?
So, from the social media standpoint, it is really LinkedIn. Like I said, I like to do speeches, so I get asked to speak a lot inside of, certainly I've done, bar associations, things like that, CPA societies, but business groups, right? So I've done some work and speeches in a lot of different business groups, chambers of commerce, things like that. I mean, just because the nature of what I do and how I approach it, it's a little different than most people are used to hearing. And there's a what I call a hunger or a thirst for knowledge on how these things work. So I said this previously, and I'll say it again. Like, it's amazing. It was amazing to me. It's not anymore. How little most people know about the process of transitioning or transacting out of their business. So there's a lot of trade associations and groups that are interested in having somebody come in who says, "Look, I don't have a preconceived notion. I do everything from liquidations up to IPOs. I'm happy to talk about different ways to exit your business. I'm happy to talk about an in-depth look at ESOPs, right? Like, and that's unusual because most people have a specific strategy or a couple strategies they talk about. I'll talk about anything they want to hear. And as far as, speaking goes, like I said, I like the interactiveness. So I think a lot of groups enjoy having me because I'm very willing and able to take the tough questions or challenges. And I'm also, I think, smart enough to know when I don't know something and tell someone, you know what, that's a great question. I don't really know, but if you give me your contact information, I'll look into it and get back to you. So I think that's a big part of it too, actually, is how much speaking we do. I did 3 speeches this week alone, and ended my week, speaking with you, which is great. I appreciate that. So I'm out there a lot.
Good. And sort of as we continue on with this, When you became an attorney,
Hmm.
did you ever experience any difference in the way you drew an attention, at least on your social media account or anything like that? How did developing an education sort of change the traffic? Because I remember you do have a bachelor's degree in political science, right?
Yep, that's correct.
Did you see a difference in the amount of attention you were getting from job propositions when you went from being in political science to now going full into law?
Oh, for sure.
No.
I tell people, and this is not to diminish, I really enjoyed my undergraduate degree and my experience. But unless you're really into going into politics, political science is what I call, what I refer to as kind of a coffee shop degree, right? You're the most popular guy in the coffee shop to talk
Wow.
to
Oh,
because you got a lot of fun. You have a lot of interesting insights, right? And
yeah.
into the world, into society. And definitely when I came out of undergrad, right, you had the collapse, as we'll call it, of the end of the towards the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Like that was a big deal. That was something everybody wanted to talk about. Eastern Europe changes and democracies going into Eastern Europe and such. So it was great from that perspective. The further I got along in education, right? So I finished my law degree. Certainly law firms are interested in talking to someone who's a lawyer, but then other channels open themselves up where things I would put out there would catch people's eye, right? Like experiences I'd had, or things I had seen, or things that I had done. It's a really interesting question to me because when I first got out of law school, social media was just at its infancy, right? It was 1996, so um, I'm not exactly sure when I discovered the World Wide Web existed, but I still remember my first email account. That was really when I was a law student. So it really evolved and evolved very quickly in my career. I'd say it really started to pick up for me personally and professionally close to the year 2000 when there was a lot more proactive work on people like myself to push published work through a social media platform. So I don't publish as much as I used to because my speaking has taken that over. I used to publish a lot more, but maybe this is a better answer to your question. When I would put something up, I would pay attention to how many people read it or how many hits I got on it, which would then tell me how close I was to the mark of what people needed to or wanted to read about. And then I would adjust my next piece to
Right.
what I believed was what people were really looking for.
Hmm.
So my own kind of quasi social experiment and trial and error to where I needed to head my career into, or at least my publishing into, so I'd be connecting with the people I wanted to connect with professionally and personally.
Hmm. And that strategy you have is very interesting. Can that be applied to whatever any other entrepreneur is doing as well?
I mean, I would think so. And I think a lot of people spend a lot of money doing that. I think I don't want to say I was ahead of the curve. I think other people were doing it. They just weren't people teaching you how to do it. It was all trial and error, right? I'm sure there's consultants you could hire that would tell you, and I know there are to help your social media presence get stronger. Um, we just did it by trial and error in those days, and it kind of worked or it didn't work. And if it didn't work, you tried something different. So yes, would be the answer to the question. I'm sure there's lots of opportunity for someone to come in and try to put some stakes in. I mean, for what it's worth, I think that people like to hear more so than anything else a stake in the ground about whatever it is you're trying to do or accomplish or get across to people. Have an opinion, have a strong opinion, and if you do, plant a flag out there and see what happens. That's where you get people's attention. They don't want to. I don't want to read wishy-washy stuff. I can say I can do this. I can do this all day long. I want somebody to tell me, hey, I want to do this, and here's why I want to do it. Okay, that's cool. Let's read that and see what that's about. I find that sort of thing much more interesting to read.
Okay. Okay. So, if you could potentially kind of go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would you say to him?
So if I went far enough back in time, I think I actually would have changed my undergraduate studies to
Mhm.
psychology and would
Wow.
have spent a lot more time doing research in those days on entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship, what makes families tick, things like that. Things that would have been directly applicable to where I sit today in my 50s, right? Um, if I'd fast forward just a little bit to my first couple years, I wouldn't have changed my schooling experience in law school or my master's degree in tax, but I probably would have told myself to get out more early. So instead of being kind of, wait your turn to what's quote my turn to like be in the front talking to people, I would have been much more I would have told myself to be much more assertive and aggressive and publish stuff a lot quicker. Like I jokingly say this, but it's not completely a joke. Um, People deeply respect, at least in my professional field, and I think even clients, although I've never really asked one, the more you publish, the more people think you know something about something. I know that's not really true, but it does take a lot of time, effort, and energy to get thoughts down on paper in a coherent, let alone attractive form for people. And the faster you can do that, at a young age, the better results you're going to get. So I think I would have told myself to be more aggressive and to be maybe a little more proactive of a listener earlier in my career, because it took me a while to discipline myself to engage my mind before my mouth. So I tell that to a lot of the young people on the team is, and it's, some people say it's a little crass. I don't think it's particularly crass, and say, look, it's just easy to remember. Engage your mind before your mouth. Think, listen before you say something, because you'll learn a lot about somebody by listening to what they're saying instead of trying to think about what you want to say next. And I was not good at that early on in my career.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned that psychology was something you were fascinated in beforehand, but I'm more concerned about you now. So how did you sort of fix that roadblock in learning more about psychology?
So I read books. I'm a prolific reader and articles, and people who know me know I like reading about stuff like that. I want to understand what makes things tick, and I have found certain threads that I want to learn more about. So I pick those up and read them. So the issue I have, and it's a habit I picked up. I started traveling a lot for my career many years ago, long before we had iPads and long before we had easy to utilize video players and things like that. So I was traveling early in my career in the days where you sat on a plane, either broke out a computer and did work, or you read. And there's only so much work I can do right on an airplane or just in an airport before I just kind of need a break. And instead of reading, casual literature, I found that if I read some sort of technical stuff outside my field, it tended to make me happier and make me more productive as a break. And that's where I started reading a lot about psychology and, about, again, what makes people tick, what makes people make decisions. I read a fair amount about collective and non-collective behavior, things like that. Following the pack versus not following the pack, things like that. And I found it fascinating, right? That people wrote about this stuff and you could glean conclusions of your own and glean ways to connect with people that were perhaps not as obvious or had been taught when I was younger.
Good. Okay, great. And as you continue on, do you think you would end up eventually teaching people your craft and what you do as an attorney as well, as maybe a coach or a consultant, or are you more so focused on just helping people kind of just fix their financial issues?
It's a great question. Like you're asking me really. So I do believe that I do teach a lot and educate a lot of the younger folks on the team. So we build a team that's, we try to get people in pretty early out of school as analysts and then kind of grow them on to senior analysts and eventually get them into the pipeline to be an advisor to businesses with the eventual goal to be a director running their own situations and deals. That is a lot of heavy, what I'll say, teaching. I did agree to become an executive in residence at a local university here, and I've certainly spoken with the deans there and some of the students about, taking what I would consider kind of real world experiences to overlay, not replace the book stuff, right? So you can't tell, but I've got two big bookshelves behind me filled with different types of books, but books are important, right? The written word and the technical stuff, that's the basics and the baseline in order to be an effective advisor. So what I can do to enhance that, to say, okay, that's what you read in the book. Here's how you would say to someone or apply it to someone. Sure. I think that at the end of the day, I've spent so much time learning how to do this, and I've spent so much of my career with education and experiences that I can't really foresee a circumstance in any foreseeable future where I would just want to stop. But there will be a point in time where I'm going to want to stop perhaps traveling so much or stop working as often as I do. And the second chapter, or maybe it's the third or fifth chapter at this point in my career, um, kind of winding down at some point and then spending more of my time as a consultant, either to end user clients or other advisors, and like distilling that knowledge out. I think would be a lot of fun, right? And the best part about that is you get to pick. I think you get to pick and choose your experiences with people more readily because the financials aren't pushing you as hard. Meaning personal financial situation, and find the people who are really receptive and want to learn this in a deep and meaningful way versus the ones who just want to skim and move on to the next thing. I like the people who've got a little more depth to them, right? To spend my time with them because they're going to listen better and want to learn more.
Beautiful. And again, this has been an excellent, excellent interview. Do you have any final words you would like to say to the audience?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to just explain for just a moment or two about the book I'm finishing because
Sure, go on.
yeah, it was very specific. So over the years, as I said, I do a lot of speaking, and people come up and say, "You should really put this all down in a book." And it's a daunting challenge, right? There's so much stories and information over a 26-year career, let alone a 30-year career, to try to distill it into meaningful stories. So I actually, before I decided to do it, I read through a lot of the what I'll call how-to books on what I do, right? And some of them are excellent. They're very well written, very good guides, but they tended to either be very technical for other advisors or just a linear, well, this is step one through step 10. And, I looked at that, I read those, and I'm like, wow, what I think is missing is just somebody to do like I do in speeches, which I just want to get out there and put some of these stories on paper to show people how to reach the right conclusion about maybe the do's and don'ts, as opposed to a true how to, because everybody's experience in this process is going to be slightly different or substantially different. So, there's going to be a series of forks in the road. And how do you effectively navigate through it? Because a fork in the road, everybody shouldn't go left and everybody shouldn't go right. And maybe there's some that shouldn't go either way and just cut their own path. So I just tried to build in a series of stories that were both entertaining, in some cases amusing, but in most cases to really try to hammer home a point for folks that when you're faced with something like this, put yourself in the situation, how would you handle it? And what would be the more effective way or the best way or what I perceive to be the best way? So it was a lot of fun to write that. And I can't thank my clients enough over the years for letting me experience this with them. I will say, as a disclaimer, none of them will be able to read this and say that story is exactly me. It's an amalgamation of stories. So I took, in some cases, pieces and parts and changed names enough so no one could look at that and say, "Hey, that's exactly what happened to me." There'll be a lot of overlap, and if you really thought about it, you might be able to put yourself somewhat in there. But I tried to make the stories interesting and not super obvious that someone would come back and say, "Oh, you kind of stole my experience." I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to be a little more, in some cases, amorphous, and in some cases, a little more specific to help make that point. But it was a lot of fun. It was a ton of work, but it was a lot of fun. And I'm looking forward to getting it out and having some other people give me feedback. And who knows, maybe there'll be a volume 2 at some point.
Beautiful. And, when do you think that book is going to be coming out?
So if you'd asked me this 6 months ago, I would have told you beginning of summer. I'm now projecting for a September publish date. And quite frankly, a lot of that just coincides with the end of what I'll say the end of summer. It's hard to put something out at that point. And I am in my final edits with my editor. So we're pretty close. And now it's just picking a date to push it out. So I'm going to say early to mid-September, it should be out.
Okay. Great. And how many different stories are actually in that book altogether, if you could estimate?
So we're not completely decided on how to break things apart, and we're still inserting and pulling out certain things. But it's looking like we'll end up with about 10 chapters, and there's anywhere from 2 to 3 stories per chapter. So a fair number, right? We're probably looking at the low end 15, the high end maybe like mid 20s, which to fully develop some of these things, yeah, it's going to be fairly hefty, right? That's a lot of stories for one book. And it's really designed to, I tried to do it in a way where I tell people who've asked me the question, like, what's the length? I'm like, I'm not sure yet. That depends on a lot of different factors. But my goal has always been for someone who, let's say, gets on an airplane in New York City, they wouldn't be able to read it between New York and Chicago. That's probably not enough time, but there would be more than enough time if they were going New York to San Francisco or somewhere in California to finish the whole thing. It's designed to be kind of a fast read and entertaining read that busy business owners could read and enjoy a little bit, but get through it relatively quickly.
Great.
No War and Peace in my future. How about that?
All right. Well, again, this has been an amazing interview. Thank you for kind of cluing us in on that book. Definitely, people here will be looking out for that. Appreciate it. So just to kind of end this off, do you have any words you'd like to give to the audience, or, kind of clue us in?
Yeah. I just say this: if you're in this situation, right, where you're take this to the entrepreneur business owner, like you've done some amazing stuff I don't know how to do and couldn't do, right? Whether you talk to me, find someone like me or who has that kind of experience that can help you successfully navigate through this final stage in that business life cycle. You've spent so much time building something, and you've probably put a little blood, sweat, and tears into that. So don't leave stuff on the table, whatever that is to you. There is an answer to successfully descending from that pinnacle of your career. Don't leave that to chance. Take control of it. You're a take control person. And for those of you who don't fit that bill, I just would say that, hey, when you have something, that you've done that's passionate to you, whatever it is, find a way to transfer that into something else as you're looking through transitions. Like, that's a big part of what I've helped people navigate is, what does the second chapter, third chapter of my life look like? And I guess that's my parting advice. And hey, I just want to thank you. I really enjoy doing these, and this was great. I really enjoyed the back and forth and the questions, the interview, and thank you so much for having me as a guest.
It's my privilege, and it's an honor to have you on my show.
Well, great.
All right. So again, this was Mr. Getty. He was an amazing guest, and let's kind of end it off here. So first of all, a special thanks to our sponsors here, Six Figure University and Jones Bay, Kimyana Jones Bay. They're focused on teaching you how to sort of get into real estate and maybe even build your own hair salon. Next person here is going to be LifeWork Systems. They're our affiliate partner. And Judy Ryan is basically an HR superstar. She works hard on helping businesses improve their HR infrastructure. And also, this is going to be on YouTube, so subscribe now to our YouTube channel. And finally, this is also available on Roku. So check us out on Roku too. This episode will be here just like all of our other episodes. All right. So I'm Jimbo Paris. This is the Jimbo Paris Show. Thank you again. Thank you for listening to the Jimbo Paris Show.